Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
Dr. Anino Emuwa, thank you for speaking to Al Jazeera Balkans.
Hanan, thank you for having me.
And let's start with your journey from being one of the first women in senior banking leadership in Nigeria to founding multiple initiatives focused on women in leadership. What motivated that shift from finance to advocacy and ecosystem building?
Well, it was actually an interesting journey because I had decided when I was very young, at 16, that I wanted to go into banking, and I have no idea why that was. And at that very young age, I remember having an interview with a director at a merchant bank in London at the time. After that, I was hooked. I was just going to do this. And at a very early age, went into corporate banking back home in Nigeria with Citibank. And at this young age of 22, 23, I was holding portfolios of very large multinationals. And I had the responsibility of creating these credit lines for them. Mm-hmm. Now, what it then occurred to me, I love this job, but it occurred to me that hang on, here we are creating, opportunities for huge multinationals, but yet we had an entrepreneurial gap. So I began to become curious about entrepreneurship, and one of the things naturally I noticed was the lack of financing, right, going to entrepreneurial firms. Mm-hmm. I had then lived in several countries in Africa, a few countries in Africa, and I saw this thing over and over again, and I thought to myself, we have an issue in Africa if entrepreneurs can't get financing in order to become big businesses. And so that's what I based my research on. My doctorate was actually on overcoming barriers to finance for entrepreneurial businesses in Nigeria, which is my case study for Africa. At the same time, I was working with female-led businesses and entrepreneurs, and I had a seminar many, many years ago and about how to help them with their businesses and marketing, finance, all of that. Almost like an MBA, right? An MBA, but for entrepreneurs, because I had done my MBA, but that was for being a corporate banker. And I now realize that women had even more barriers. So at the same time, in what I was doing on one side, I could see the barriers that female entrepreneurs were having. On the other hand, I could see finance was just an issue altogether. But I then more and more became interested in this whole concept of female leadership. And as studying economics, I had went through the data, looked at a lot what was happening behind the scenes, the channels to get women into leadership. And just going through data at universities, certain degrees like economics, which was the classic route into banking in those days, into corporate banking or institutional banking or investment banking, when I started to see how underrepresented women were, I didn't realize it when I was doing it. It was just natural for me to do all those things. But when I realized that you had a problem with representation at all levels, I then knew that we really had to go into looking more deeply into those barriers that stop women into leadership positions.
You've worked across different countries, you've worked across different continents. So going from this corporate banking in Nigeria and then throughout the whole journey to advising global boards today, how do you define power in today's corporate world, and who holds it?
Oh, this is so important because very often we talk about leadership and positions. So who is the CEO or who is the chair or who is on the board, right? But that alone doesn't determine power. Obviously, your position grants you power. But what power is the ability to influence, right? That is what power is. And so if you do have position, but you're not influencing it, then how much power do you have? So your power goes way beyond the job and your responsibility. It is how can you use that to influence other things that are happening. So first of all, there is a strong correlation between power and money. And when you have, in the case of, the resources, most of the resources being in the hands of one gender, men, right, it also deprives power from other people. So generally speaking, economic power is one route, or economic resources is one route to power. So if you look at who holds the money, that already tells you. Who holds the position, that's the next thing, and that tells you. And from that, we can sort of see who wields the influence, really. But there are other ways of wielding influence, but certainly position, right, and the financial resources are the two most important. I mean, obviously, political leadership, for example, are the most important things to wield power.
So besides the economical background,
Yes.
you said the position is important.
Yes.
So what structural changes do you think are needed to get more women into boardrooms, or meaning into those positions beyond mentoring and to an extent networking events, you know?
Okay, this is, and I think that we need to look more about this, because one, if you look at, when you look at the level of underrepresentation, and we're talking about women being, you know, half the population of the world, then what we have is a huge problem. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So first of all, look at the, you know, the country or the city. So you might have cultural barriers, and I think we understand that from the different parts of the world that we're coming from. Two is that very often we have biases, and those biases are actually inculcated in all of us, because the usual model for leadership is a male model of leadership, and so we ascribe some of those characteristics to a successful leadership, which is not necessarily the case, right? So you have subconscious bias. Another thing that we often don't look at very deeply is our laws. Some of these laws were created in almost medieval times, and a lot of them still exist, which is why I love the work that at the World Bank that women, business and the law look at. And so some of these have created institutional barriers as well. When we look within organizations, data is so important. If you're not looking at data, right, then you don't know what is happening. Okay, so data is important. And also, one of the important things that recent research has shown is when we look at inclusive behaviors. So even for those organizations that get women in through the door, why is it that women are not rising? Or if they're rising and they leave, very often it's because the environment is not inclusive. So we also have to look at that. Hiring practices, of course, you know, are we getting into those pools where there are women or not? Are we using the language that attracts women or not? What is the work environment like? Harassment is a big issue, which is sometimes is not spoken about, but it has to. Very few women are going to stay in an environment, and those who stay, very unfortunately, they don't have choices, right? But it isn't going to allow them to progress. So that's another issue that is not really well looked at, but is truly important for getting women to rise.
We're here at the ESG Summit, and this three-letter word is something that we hear more and more often. And you work with boards on ESG strategy. In your experience, I need to ask you, what separates real ESG commitment from just pure box ticking and greenwashing?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, in the current times we are in, which is really complex, right? The geopolitics, regulation and all of that is really complex. So the first thing for those people watching is that when you see those words, those letters ESG magically disappearing from a company's site, also it is a reflection of times, right? So you may see words like, you know, opportunities, environment, sustainability, etc., etc. So we have terminology, and the narrative is one thing that you might see changing. But what determines it? One, ESG, like many other of these acronyms or things, very often it's almost like a stamp, right, for the organization to say that you're doing good or doing well. And sometimes there's misuse of that. Okay, so what this scenario is doing, which is not a bad thing, to be honest, right, is if we remove all of that, then let's look by the actions at those who are really doing the work, not those who say, I have an ESG report or I have a policy. Let's look at it and look deeply. So we are in an environment where there are organizations that work with companies where they actually look deeply at what it is that they do. One of the boards I'm on, we work with organizations in the industry. They actually look, and these are voluntary organizations who have come to say, we really want to deal with this issue, right? And they come voluntarily. So one is, it's look at not what people say, organizations say, but what do they do, right? And also, how do they make sure that ESG or sustainability, inclusion, and all of those are really part and parcel of what it is they're doing in the organization, right? Sometimes there can be a lack of transparency. Transparency is important. In Europe, we do have a lot of regulation, although some of that is also softening as well. So the fact that you have to adhere to regulation is also important, right, on the climate action. Those are really important as well.
You founded African Women on Board to amplify African female leadership. What are the region-specific challenges? And I need to add here that obviously Africa as a continent is very large and very diverse, so to call it just region-specific would be perhaps problematic. So I will let you choose which region of Africa you'd like to talk about the challenges, but also what are the strengths that the global conversation about Africa often misses?
Okay, first of all, it's Africa Women CEOs Network, which I founded, which is a network of women CEOs, including corporates, also entrepreneurs and women on board, so directors, chairs of organizations, and heads of institutions. Whilst it's really private sector, very often we actually, it's not a complete Chinese wall between the two. We have women in business who've gone into politics or into government. So we do have some senior leaders who, at the ministerial level, for example, who are part of our network. Yes, certainly there are regional differences, but I tell you, it was quite a few years ago, but I think it was possibly maybe 2021 or so, or 2020, so 4 or 5 years ago, we actually worked with another organization in the UK where we actually did a study across Africa looking at the representation of women in executive positions and on boards, so really the C-suite, top level, and the boards. And it was actually quite interesting because we looked at the stock exchanges and took the top, all the organizations at the biggest organizations in Africa. Actually quite interesting. What we actually found was that female representation on boards and in C-suite was actually higher than our Western counterparts. That was one shocking and interesting thing. So there's a lot that is actually happening. At the same time, what we found were the regional differences. So we saw, and probably not surprising for cultural, religious, historical reasons, that the North African countries didn't perform quite as well as their Eastern and Western African peer groups. So there was that. But at the same time, that doesn't give a picture of everything. So that is a particular sector which only hires a certain amount of women. By the time we look and we go down and drill down further with the data that we have, representation is probably not so good. And certainly with smaller companies where there's little transparency is not so good at all. And then we're talking about businesses, and we mustn't forget looking at representation of, for example, lawmakers as well, to see across the continent what is happening as well. Certainly there have been improvements, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So long and short of the story is that it's mixed. The top level companies, at least those years ago, were actually doing quite well. Lower down is a different story, and there are significant regional differences, certainly.
So you've lived, as we know, and worked in both Europe and Africa. So maybe also speaking about what you just said, the surprising data you found regarding Western and Eastern Africa, what concrete opportunities do you see for a stronger collaboration between Europe and Africa in governance, innovation, and leadership? Is there something that we can learn from each other?
Oh, there's absolutely a lot we can learn from each other. And I think there has been a move towards this sort of stronger cooperation that we've seen in recent years. First of all, if we look at where it stems from simply when we look at global growth. Of course, during the COVID crisis, a bit different. But some of the highest performing, in terms of growth, countries were in Africa, right? So there's that. The other thing is when we look at innovation, okay, we talk about innovation from financial inclusion and all of that. One of the classic cases, of course, was M-Pesa, which is before financial inclusion became a thing, right?
If I may add also,
sure.
Before digitalization of finances happened and took the turn it has in the Western world, Kenya, where M-Pesa is, was already very, very used in very wide population, right?
Oh, completely. And I remember, I'll just give a small example. I remember this was a friend in Switzerland, and who said that very sadly, her mother had a lot of money taken from her account in several debits. And for a second, I was a bit surprised because I thought, how come it wasn't recognized after the first, second? But you see, Europe, it's now changed in the last few years, legacy systems. So what happened was, in Africa, we were able to leapfrog, right, that and actually deploy, and we deployed faster and quicker sort of innovation in the banking system that was way ahead, right, of Europe and even the US. So there's that opportunity as well to leapfrog. We don't need to go through legacy, because once you have legacy technology, it's difficult to chuck it out when you spend a lot of money on it and totally invest. We can invest in new technology, and it's not just investing. We are actually creating the technology. When we look at, through COVID, the payment systems, we have some of the unicorns who are based on that, because simply it was just a ripe market waiting to happen. The level of growth in Africa, what it has done is take countries from, to grow the middle income, right, of countries. And once you have middle income, then of course it means that you have, commercial activity, you have a big consumer market, right? So that is what has been the beauty of Africa, and also led to innovation, a youth population as well. So these are some of the factors, right?
Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda are some of the innovation hubs that are leading the African tech ecosystem, and also setting some examples on a global level. Besides some of these factors that you just mentioned, what factors drove this surge, and more importantly, can the momentum be continued?
I think that there's certainly different reasons why, that happened. There was some kind of organic reasons. I think M-Pesa had a role, right, in that, in Kenya, because it addressed financial inclusion, right? Mm-hmm. And then there was this drive to financial inclusion. Nigeria, which at the time, maybe not with exchange rates, was becoming, one of the biggest economies, and became biggest economy in Africa. So the population, right, and the size of economy naturally made it a ripe place, right, for development of technology, for fintech, for financial inclusion, for innovation, and then innovation. Because innovation, to be honest, to some extent, we had a lot of innovation in fintech, right? Mm-hmm. But it's moved to all fields, right? And the infrastructure behind fintech, not just fintech companies, but the infrastructure that supports it. But also, when we look at Rwanda, we have the government of Rwanda actually went out with a policy to drive innovation. So there's also that. So you do have the history, you do have the markets, you have, government's action. Those are some of the key factors that are driving that. And once you have that, you then have the individuals, right? The entrepreneurs, because there's value being created, investors are interested, and that the more you have investment going into, or investor money going into it, the more you can develop innovation and invest in ventures.
When we talked about ESG and these sustainability discourses, yes, how do they, let's say, translate in regions where sometimes basic infrastructure, and we're talking about some of these countries in Africa, and not carbon reduction, is the pressing issues?
The region that is most affected by climate change in the world is Africa. Mm-hmm. Many of the issues that we see in Africa are related to the consequences of climate change, right? So for example, in the Chad region, with the Lake Chad, which has reduced the amount in 30 years or 20 years, the amount of water, and that fed the whole region, right? And so when we see the rise of things, including migration, a lot of migration is actually climate migration without realizing it. 2, terrorism, because how are people surviving, right? Once people are deprived, it's so easy for them to be shifted into things they should not be doing, right? So one is recognizing all of that. And when we saw COP at the last COP, there were monies put together. I think it was probably 300 billion. What we actually require is about 1.3 trillion, right? That is globally. And a lot of that has to go into Africa. So that's the first thing, investment, right? And global investment in, it's not just that we're most affected. We are contributed the least towards the emission gases, right? So the first thing is that Africa needs to be financed, climate finance, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. And without that, it's quite difficult to answer some of these questions we're asking. The thing is to finance also in terms of our climate innovation, or climate action innovation, because those who live in the country, those who live in the regions, they have a better understanding of the answers. Sometimes they are unable to give workable solutions purely because they don't have the financing. So that is the key thing. Now, Africa is, we have countries like Nigeria where we are creating, or rather where energy or fossil fuel really supports our economy. It's the bulk of our production in terms of foreign exchange, for example. But when you have countries, right, that are growing and growing very quickly, irrespective of how much green gases they are producing per person, you have to look at how much they are growing the population and the size of the economy. It's only natural that you're using more energy, the faster it is you're growing population and industrializing. So there has to be this, there has to be, when you look at climate action, fossil fuels, emissions, reduction, and all of that, it really has to look at the realities of the countries, right? It's not that it doesn't need to be addressed, but financing is important. 2, expectations, and 3, Africa will develop, it has to develop, and nothing should be put in the place to stop that happening.
But then is the global governance narrative, which is often dominated by Western-led or Western institutions, inclusive or even aware of these perspectives from the global South or Africa, as an example? It's
getting better. A few COPs ago, the voice of Africa really wasn't there. So in terms of solutions, we're having more and more the voices of Africans and African governments. Particularly, we must talk about the president of Kenya, who has been really very active in terms of speaking about the climate action initiatives and the requirement for financing. So more and more there's recognition that we really have to look at what's happening within Africa. So yes, it's improving. There's still a long way to go yet, and I think that a lot of the work that has been done so far has also realized that yes, it is true that the paths are different, and we need to look at some kind of equitable and fair equity and justice when it concerns Africa's path when we're looking at climate action.
And finally, what would the success that we see today look like, in your opinion? Is it a more diverse boardroom, or is it a completely reimagined model of leadership?
We are at a time that is actually quite concerning for many people around the world and organizations, and particularly for women, where we see the rollback of women's rights, number one, and number two, when we look at organizations that are rolling back on things which they consider their core principles. So that is the first thing that concerns women, in leadership, and anybody who realizes that, it's actually important to have more women in leadership. However, what I'd like to say is that the path of progress is very often not linear, right? So what we're seeing, I think, is just point in time. But so it's on the way up. Women have never had so much in terms of rights, opportunities, education, and that rollback. Cannot roll women's programs back to the 1950s or whatever it is. It's not going to happen. We also have the transfer of wealth, right, into the control of women's hands. About 30 trillion is going to be transferred into women's hands, in the coming years. So women actually have, when we talked earlier about, money and power, will have the power and influence. And that is what I think even the banking sector is not actually dealing with, and having those right solutions. So once you have, power, rights, money, and decision-making and access, we are moving forward. We just came from the Commission on the Status of Women, and it is from the UN. It's a global gathering yearly, and it's never had so many gender advocates, women, ever before. There's the highest number. So there's actually that feeling that we just have to push forward and continue to do things, and that there are lots of success stories in the UK, for example. The 30% Club, which was formed from some years ago to get at least 30% of women into boards, I think they have far surpassed that, right? So they're case studies. So whilst we see a rollback, whilst we see things which seem to suggest that women's rights in the boardroom, in executive suite, right, are being are being reduced, but that's not the reality. So it's not to feel complacent. It's to continue. Whatever the geopolitical situation is going to pass, right? And the path is actually on the way forward. So to women out there, to organizations out there who realize that diversity is actually leading to better results, is just continue what it is you're doing, and just leave the room there for women and men to work together in order to create more inclusive, more performing, more economically stable, more socially stable, and actually more peace and less risk.
Mrs. Emuwa, Anino, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?